Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here, and we're going to finish out the urinary system with our third lecture, talking about some of the special additional functions of the kidney. So a quick review of the nephron and its four functions that we talked about last lecture. So as you recall, blood comes in through the afferent arteriole into the glomerular capillary. We create pressure in that capillary with the efferent arteriole, and that causes solutes and water to move out into Bowman's capsule as the filtrate, which then moves into the proximal convoluted tubule. The remainder of the blood then continues out into the peritubular capillaries. We first talked about, so the second job then is tubular reabsorption. We're going to reabsorb from the filtrate back into the bloodstream those things we don't want to lose, such as glucose and amino acids and some sodium. We're then, the filtrate's then going to move through the loop of Henle, where I talked about some reabsorption of water and sodium can also occur. And then finally into the distal convoluted tubule, where we're going to see tubular secretion. So those waste products that stayed behind in the bloodstream, those that didn't move out into the filtrate, remember, because not all of it moves into the filtrate, so urea, creatinine, ammonia, those things are going to be actively secreted out into the urine, which then moves into the collecting duct. And if ADH is present, so if ADH is present, made by the hypothalamus, then water channels will open in the collecting duct and water will move out of the filtrate and back into the bloodstream. So those are the four jobs of the nephron that we talked about. Here they are, just listed in a different graphic. Different people like different types of visual information. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the special jobs of the kidney that aren't as directly related to excreting wastes and holding on to nutrients. The first is renin production. So the kidneys make a hormone called, or an enzyme, excuse me, called renin, and they make them in a very special place. So here we have on the right-hand side a diagram of a glomerulus. This is the ball of glomerular capillaries in here. Here is Bowman's capsule in the beginning of the proximal convoluted tubule. And so what you'll see is that there's a special area of cells in this yellow circle here. See these green cells that are directly adjacent to the afferent arteriole. So this is the afferent arteriole in this particular image. And so they are sensing blood pressure as well as sodium concentrations in that blood. If either sodium concentration or blood pressure is low, then these cells, this juxtaglomerular apparatus, the JGA, is going to secrete this enzyme called renin. So you can see it here on the right in a diagram. You can also see it here under the microscope. So these are the cells of the JGA. Juxtaglomerular just means next to the glomerulus, right? So juxtaposition means putting something next to, so juxtaglomerular apparatus. I don't know why they didn't come up with a better name, but JGA works pretty well. Okay. So what renin will do then is it's going to activate a whole bunch of other hormones and enzymes. It's kind of a complicated process that eventually is going to result in the production of a hormone called aldosterone. And so this is what's going to do the business of what we've set in motion here. So aldosterone will directly cause increased reabsorption of sodium. So remember, I was a little cagey about reabsorption of sodium. I was very clear that glucose and amino acids are going to be reabsorbed at nearly 100%, but I didn't say that for sodium. So sodium, it kind of depends on what's going on in our body. So if renin is produced by the JGA, we will then produce the hormone aldosterone, and that will cause us to reabsorb more sodium from the filtrate or the urine back into the bloodstream. Now sodium, as you may recall, is very osmotically active, and so water will follow it because of its osmotic pressure. So if you reabsorb more sodium from the filtrate into the blood, you will also end up reabsorbing more water from the filtrate into the blood. So now you have more sodium and water staying in the blood instead of being lost in the urine, which is going to beef up and pump up your blood volume, right? Your plasma volume, which will help you to increase your blood pressure, right? Because if you have more volume in the same given container, that increases pressure. So let's kind of go through this one by one on the next slide. So if we have either low blood pressure or low blood sodium, the JGA is going to secrete renin, an enzyme. That will put in motion a bunch of consequences that will ultimately end up in production of the hormone aldosterone by the adrenal glands, adrenal glands are located, they sit right on top of the kidneys. Ad means toward, so adrenal, they're toward the renals, they're toward the kidneys. So aldosterone then is going to cause increased sodium reabsorption, and then you'll get increased water absorption because of the osmotic activity of that sodium. So more sodium and water is going to move from the filtrate into the bloodstream, which will increase your blood volume and therefore your blood pressure. This is a really important system that we have to make sure we keep blood pressure high enough to send blood to all of our tissues throughout our body, right? We spend a lot of time kind of in healthcare talking about people's blood pressure being too high, but it also has to be high enough, right? And so this system is part of what helps regulate that. This is a diagram that shows you kind of the full sequence of events that occurs. So remember, if you have a drop in blood pressure, fluid volume, or blood sodium levels, which they don't specify here, then the JGA is going to release renin. So you can see I've kind of shaded out a lot of these things because I don't expect you to learn them, but I just want you to take a look. The liver is involved here by making a substance called angiotensinogen. And then renin turns that into angiotensin 1. And then the lungs make an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, which converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And then that's what tells the adrenal glands to make aldosterone, right? And then the aldosterone, so now we pick up where we left off, right, tells the kidneys to reabsorb more salt and water. So the other reason that I wanted to point this out is to let you know that in this course, a lot of times we kind of simplify things to help you understand the basic concepts, but our bodies are really complicated and there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So that's why, for example, people need to go to medical school for many, many years and then do residency, right? It takes a lot of time and study to learn how all of these things work. So I just want you to have some appreciation for that. I also want you to notice, isn't it weird, right, that the lungs are making an enzyme that's important for the control of blood volume and blood pressure? And it is kind of weird. I don't know why. But the other thing that's interesting about this is that this particular enzyme and the receptors for it seem to be part of how the novel coronavirus actually infects the lung tissue, which is kind of weird and bizarre. So it's like, wow, you wouldn't think that the lungs would have anything to do with this system, but they do. And because of it, they seem to have this vulnerability to this new infectious agent, right? Very complicated and also very fascinating. All right, moving on. The second thing the kidneys are going to do is make erythropoietin, or EPO for short. So you might remember from when we talked about the blood and how the blood is produced. So erythrocyte production is in the red bone marrow, right, from stem cells, and EPO is the hormone that tells the bone marrow to make more erythrocytes. The way this works is if the kidney senses a low level of erythrocytes or primarily low oxygen, if it's like, oh, there's not as much oxygen in the bloodstream as I think there should be, then the kidney will secrete more EPO, which is a hormone that travels through the bloodstream, and when it arrives at the red bone marrow, it says you need to make more erythrocytes. So it goes kind of like this, right? So if you have low O2, the kidney senses low oxygen, makes EPO, which then travels the bone marrow through the bloodstream and tells it to make more erythrocytes, therefore improving the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood and therefore hopefully increasing oxygen in the blood. This is the reason behind training at altitude that we talked about when we talked about blood, right? So when you go to a high altitude place like Aspen, Colorado, the partial pressure of oxygen is actually lower, so you can, it's harder to absorb oxygen from the air into your pulmonary capillaries. And so your kidney is going to sense those decreased oxygen levels in the blood, make more EPO, so then your bone marrow is going to make more erythrocytes, and that's going to improve the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood, therefore maintaining homeostasis, right? So after you are at altitude for a period of time, your body will adjust. You will actually have more erythrocytes than you had when you were down at sea level, and that's a normal adaptation to living at altitude. And then, of course, if you come back to sea level, you have an advantage in terms of your oxygen carrying capacity compared to everybody else. So that's why athletes sometimes train at altitude. The third and final special function of the kidney that we're going to talk about today is activation of vitamin D. We've talked about vitamin D before, way back in the beginning of the semester when we talked about skin, and then we talked about it again when we talked about calcium regulation when we did the skeletal system. So you'll recall that vitamin D is produced in the skin as a response to exposure to UVB rays. It then is going to travel through the body and actually be processed by the liver and then ultimately get to the kidneys, where the kidneys are going to convert it to its active form. So these other forms of vitamin D are not physiologically active in the body. It requires this activation by the kidney to 1,25-hydroxy vitamin D3 to actually do the work of vitamin D. And let's remember that the work of vitamin D is to allow you to absorb calcium from your diet, right, in the intestines. So calcium, as you'll recall, is really important for the inorganic matrix of bone, right? It gives it its hardness. We also have collagen, that protein fiber, to give it its resilience, but calcium crystals are going to give it its hardness. Calcium is also important for muscle contraction. So you'll recall the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When the action potential travels down the sarcolemma, down the T-tubules to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that causes them to release calcium. And that release of calcium causes tropomyosin to move troponin off of actin's binding site. So then myosin can grab onto it and form that cross bridge and then do the power stroke. So calcium is also very important for muscle contraction. And then finally, calcium is really important for nerve signaling. You'll recall as the action potential travels down the axon, reaches the axon terminal, that causes calcium gates to open. Calcium moves inside the axon terminal, and that's what triggers the release of the synaptic vesicles, right, that carry the neurotransmitters. So that is absolutely essential for releasing the neurotransmitter into the synapse and therefore giving that signal to the next cell. So vitamin D is really important because without it, we can't absorb the calcium from the food we eat. And if we don't have vitamin D, we don't have activated vitamin D, we can have low calcium levels, which of course can cause problems with the bones, rickets if you get it when you're young, osteomalacia if you have soft bones when you're older. And then of course, calcium is also important for muscle contraction and the exocytosis of the synaptic vesicles carrying neurotransmitters. So our jobs of the kidney, this is a slightly different way of organizing them. Sometimes you see this in the book, so I thought I would present it to you this way, right? So they produce enzymes and hormones. Renin is that enzyme that will eventually help increase blood pressure via aldosterone, which causes increased reabsorption of sodium and water. Also EPO, which is that hormone that stimulates the bone marrow to make more erythrocytes. The kidney also responds to hormones, right? So it responds to aldosterone, it has to listen to it and follow its instructions to reabsorb more sodium, which causes increased reabsorption of water that follows it due to its osmotic pressure. And the kidney also has to listen to ADH, which you'll recall is made by the hypothalamus in order to signal us to reabsorb more water from the collecting ducts. Finally, the kidney will activate vitamin D, which we just reviewed. So the mighty kidney, right? So it does a lot more than just produce urine, but producing urine is super duper important because it allows us to eliminate waste, regulate total body water and sodium and other electrolyte concentrations. It also allows us to regulate our blood pH by the excretion of hydrogen ions, right? Super duper important. It also activates vitamin D. It can produce, the JGA can produce renin, which is important for maintaining blood pressure and volume. And then, of course, it also produces EPO so that we can continue to make new erythrocytes. So let's do a few mystery cases and kind of deduce our way through these. First of all, Roland, he goes to the health center for an STI test. Good for you, Roland, excellent. But when he checks in, they find his blood pressure is really high. And so I'm like, ooh, something's going on. And there's no evidence that he has activated his sympathetic nervous system, which you know will also increase blood pressure, right? So I don't see dilated pupils, he's not sweaty, his heart rate isn't high, right? So no evidence of activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So you have to think, what else could cause the blood pressure to be abnormally high? So I'm going to actually order some blood tests. I'm specifically going to look at his sodium level. And in Roland, his sodium level is really high. So something is wrong. That should not normally happen. So we need to think, well, what could this be that could cause high sodium level and high blood pressure? So if you think back on this lecture, right, what causes you to reabsorb more sodium in the kidney? Well, if the kidneys are producing renin, which then goes on to cause production of aldosterone. And then if you have renin and aldosterone activated and present in your system, you're going to reabsorb more sodium as well as more water, and that is going to increase your blood pressure. So this case is an example of someone who has, usually it's a problem with the aldosterone specifically. Most typically, you just produce extra aldosterone for a number of reasons rather than renin being the problem, but sometimes renin can be the problem too. So that is the case of Roland. He has too much renin and or aldosterone, and so he's reabsorbing too much sodium, and that is making his blood pressure too high. What about Effie? So she's going to be in the next Hunger Games, and as you know, she doesn't have very many scruples. She's not very ethical. So she wants to give herself every advantage she can in terms of her physical performance. So what might she do? Right, so this one's pretty straightforward. We just talked about this. So she might go to some place that's really high altitude and start doing her training there. When she gets there, at first, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is lower, and so she's going to have less oxygen in her bloodstream. Kidneys are going to sense that. They're going to produce EPO. Her bone marrow then will respond by making more erythrocytes, which will increase her oxygen carrying capacity and bring her oxygen levels back up to normal. When she then comes to compete in the Hunger Games, if they're down at a lower elevation, she now has more erythrocytes than the typical contestant. And so she has better oxygen carrying capacity than her competitors. Oh, and so of course, if you can carry more oxygen, you can do more aerobic cellular respiration, right? So you're going to be fitter, you're going to be able to exert, do more work, actually. Okay, so what about Carrie? She's not feeling good at all. So we do some blood tests, and it turns out her blood calcium level is abnormally high. So let's think about what could be causing your blood calcium to be abnormally high. And so this is an opportunity for us to remember when we talked about calcium homeostasis when we did the skeletal system. So what were the two hormones that are involved with calcium homeostasis? So you might remember one was parathyroid hormone made by the parathyroid glands, which are located behind the thyroid. The other is calcitonin, which is produced by the thyroid gland itself. So the way I keep those straight is that calcitonin tones the calcium down. So calcitonin will decrease blood calcium levels. Therefore, PTH, or parathyroid hormone, will increase blood calcium levels. So if I do a blood test on someone and their blood calcium level is too high, one of the first things I'm going to check then, the next test I'm going to order, is a parathyroid hormone level. So let's say in Carrie's case, however, that parathyroid hormone level comes back normal. So that is not the problem. There is not an overproduction of PTH causing her high calcium. So then we have to think about, well, what else is involved in calcium homeostasis? And of course, the answer is vitamin D. We've talked about this before. So vitamin D allows you to absorb calcium from your intestines, and if you massively overdose on vitamin D, which is difficult to do, but if you massively overdose on vitamin D, you actually can absorb so much calcium from the food in your intestines that your blood calcium levels can get too high. Obviously, your kidney is going to do its best to compensate for this, and it's going to do its best to try to excrete that calcium into the urine. But there's only so much that the kidney can do, right? If you're really absorbing too much from your food. So if you test, one of the things we'll do sometimes to figure out what's going on in this situation is we will collect urine from people for a 24-hour period and see how much calcium is being excreted by their kidneys in that 24-hour period. That sometimes is a useful diagnostic test as well to get a sense of what is going on. All right, so we've talked about the special jobs of the kidney in this lecture. Renin Production, so if your blood pressure is too low or your blood sodium is too low, the JGA will make renin, which leads to a complicated series of reactions, ultimately to the production of the hormone aldosterone, which will cause the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. Water will follow due to the osmotic pressure of sodium, and therefore that will increase your blood volume and blood pressure. The second special job was the production of EPO, or erythropoietin, in the context of low blood oxygen levels that will cause the bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes. And then finally, the kidneys will activate vitamin D, which was produced originally in the skin in response to UVB radiation, ultimately converted first in the liver and then by the kidney to its active form to allow for absorption of calcium from food in the intestines. So your in-class activity for today's lecture is to do a review worksheet, which is posted in Canvas. You can either print it out, complete it by hand, and then scan or take pictures or otherwise upload your completed worksheet. Or if you want to try to type things in a Microsoft Word document, you're welcome to do that. It's not easy to do some of the labeling, but you're welcome to try whatever works well for you and then upload it to Canvas so that you can get graded and get credit for it. All right, I look forward to hearing your questions.